pass-through entity identifying number. And, of course, the all-important amount that has been expended. This is the final product that you want and that you want to have materially correct. If it's not materially correct, it could lead to a qualified opinion. If you don't have a process in place and internal controls in place, this could lead to a federal finding. But you don't actually create this schedule. So how do you get there? The high-level answer is that for your part, you get there when you input grant information onto Gateway. Our IT department will be running a macro, and from this information, produce the SEPA schedule. That's just the way we do it for your financial statements. And like the financial statements, you will be attesting to the completeness and accuracy of the SEPA schedule. It is your schedule. You've inputted the information, we're just running a macro. I don't want you to get confused by the schedule in the annual report being called the grant schedule and what I'm calling the SEPA. The information is one and the same. And I want to emphasize that the information that is inputted into the annual report and SEPA are for federal grants only. It might be direct from the feds or it might be indirect. Most of the federal money that you get is indirect, usually passed through from the state. But only federal money, whether it's direct or indirect, will go into the grant/SEPA schedule. And it will not include any match. I know all of you have spent federal grants, so you all will input into the grant schedule for the annual report. Not all of you, around 10 of you, just as what we've been talking about, will have the SEPA report in your audited financial statements. It'll again only be if you have expended $500,000 during the calendar year. But again, all of you will be inputting into the annual report under grant schedule in the Gateway, and it is extremely important that the information you put into this annual report be accurate, whether it ends up in a SEPA or not. And why? Well, I know you have that personal want to have accurate information, and I'll tell you, we're also finding that quite a few people are going to the Gateway system to get financial data, and this includes the federal data. We are contacted by universities, by study groups. You know, we will tell them it's unaudited information, but a lot of them just want to get a feel for things, and so they are using the Gateway data. And also you need to remember that when we come to audit, this is what we use to initially determine whether or not you'll be receiving a federal audit. If you underreport, and initially if you underreport this, then you might not be considered for a federal audit. There's a time limit to get it in to the feds. And so that might mean that the report doesn't get in to the feds in a timely manner. If you over-report and you get a federal audit costs you more, and it's more time consuming for you and for us both. Either way, you may also receive a finding because that is an indicator that you don't have controls in place if the expenditure amounts are not correct or if you're not reporting all of the grants that you have. So if you're close, and this is one thing the field examiners stress to me to stress to you, if you are close to that $500,000 expenditure, look at it, maybe recalculate it. Just be really careful, because even if it's $501,000, now you've got a federal audit. If it's $499,999, then you don't. So you do really want to be careful about that. Let's stop right here for a second and pull out the handout entitled Internal Controls over Federal Grant Schedules. This is generic. This is a finding. This is the generic finding that many of you received. You may have had all of these elements in it, or you might have only had parts of it. Might not have looked exactly like this, but I thought it would be beneficial for us to kind of go over this, so as we're going through the rest of the presentation, you can look to see how that it would help you to alleviate this finding or avoid this finding. So for this finding, the schedule of expenditures of federal awards provided for audit was inaccurate, and the following errors were found in the CFA, which are described. One common one is the schedule did not include some or all grants, and then we list the number of the federal programs, and this resulted in the CFA presentation for audit to be understated. We'll give the dollar amount, and we'll list out those grants. Now, the next thing that you'll read here, it says adjustments were recorded and approved by county's management for presentation in this report. That's very important. When we do find that that has occurred, we'll come to you with the adjustments, and this will prevent the qualified opinion. It won't prevent the finding if you make those adjustments, but it will prevent the qualified opinion. Number two is the schedule included state grants and or matching funds. Again, federal only, no state money, no matching. So again, what you're going to have there is that the grant schedule would be overstated. Sometimes the programs are combined together. One of them could be the Title 4D, where you have ARA and incentive, regular incentive funds combined, and they're supposed to be separated. Sometimes grants appear to be very similar in nature, and so they've been combined together. So that, again, is something that you need to be careful. Programs, you might have programs where, and we do look at this, and it is considered part of the control, where you have incorrect CFDA numbers or the titles were incorrect. And then finally, on number 5, it says each county department is responsible for overseeing the grants it receives. This may or may not be true in your county, though it is true in most counties. Department staff responsible for the administration and reporting the federal awards did not provide accurate information for the preparation of the CFA to the county auditor's office. So this is one of the things we're going to be talking about today, is how to gather that information, having policies in place so that you can get the right information. And we'll skip over the rest of the finding, but I think it wouldn't hurt to go ahead, because that really is, I think it does tell you all of the mishaps that could occur that you need to be cognizant of, and that you need to have those policies and procedures in place so that you can avoid those pitfalls. So, as you can see, accuracy is not just for amounts, it's also for the other information that's provided. So how do you get to this accurate information? A big part of it is explained within it. And in the finding, it says that the auditor's files did not have grant award letters, grant application, grant budgets, and other grant documentations from the various departments. We recommend that you have a grant file for each grant that your county receives, whether the grant is federal or not. You need to have a policy and process in place to gather the information you need. I know that earlier this year and last year, I've heard from some of you that you went to your commissioners to get a formal policy, and some of them were like, why? Why do we need to have this? Since then, many of you have received a finding. I think now they might be a little bit more supportive of the idea of having a formal policy for your county, so it's worth that try again if you were turned down before. Formal policy, of course, puts all departments on alert that they are required to provide information to your office so that the county doesn't receive the finding. It is a federal requirement that there be sufficient internal controls in place so that an accurate CFA report is provided. If it doesn't come from the commissioners, then you will need to disseminate a process to all the offices and departments in the county. And I would recommend that you have a written process in place that documents how that you require the various offices and departments to provide you with the necessary information. This could be informational email that you send out twice a year, quarterly, or something like that, that provides the federal requirement. The federal requirement is under A133, subpart .300 and .310 in the finding that you have with you. That actually is documented in that finding. You might also have in that email that it's a statutory requirement under IC 5-11-1-4. This is where you have to report for the annual report, and this is part of that annual report. And this way they'll know what authority that you are acting under. It's not just something that is convenient for you, that makes your life easier. It's something that they need. This email would also state the documentation that's required. This should be at least part of the grant agreement that gives the information of whether or not it's a state, federal, the amount, CFDA number. In some situations, your award letter will have that information. And also, one part of the county that would be helpful and that maybe a formal policy might not be as helpful with is with the courts. As you know, they do not always feel that they have to follow county policy, and this will let them know that the requirements are from the feds as part of their accepting any federal funding. One thing that I provided last year and have again this year with a couple of updates, which came from input from our field examiners, is what we call the grant summary form, which you have a copy of, and you can look at that or you can go along with the PowerPoint. This form, if it's filled out accurately, will provide you with the information that you need to determine whether a grant should be on the grant schedule, as well as the information that needs to be inputted on the grant schedule, with, of course, the exception of the actual expenditure activity. You can fill out this form based on documentation that you receive, and then see where all the holes are that you don't have the right information, or you could send this out to the departments, require them to fill it out so they can see where the holes are, and then provide it to you. First is the local project name on the grant summary. That is the name used to locally identify the project. For many grants, this would be the same name as the formal grant name. but many differ especially if it's a project. So there could be a difference in that. Award number. This is the number that the awarding agency has assigned to your grant and should be included in the award letter. Sometimes there's no award number. The best example I can think of for that is Title 4D. In those cases, you would leave that blank or say no award number, and then in the gateway you will leave that blank when you input your grant information. Next is award name. This is the name that the awarding agency has assigned to your grant and should be, again, in the award letter. This next slide is award method / grant type. In the gateway system, it's called grant type. I don't want to have any confusion because last year on the grant summary, I called it award method. The award method grant type is simply how that the awarding agency is providing the funding to the county. The method most commonly used is grant reimbursement, where the grantee expends its own funds first and then based on these expenditures, request reimbursement from the awarding agency. The other more common grant is where the money is advanced and then expended by the grantee. The grantee usually must provide reports to the awarding agency of the expenditures and the timing of the expenditures. And we'll talk a little bit more about these two types in a little bit. Then there is other listed on there. And you might have both other and advance or reimbursement. And so if that's the case, indicate that on the summary. For example, the grant may be in the form of cash, but it might also have non-cash. This could be like for immunization shots, but there's also a grant award dollar-wise that's given. On the summary sheet, I've indicated other than C note, so I put under the notes non-cash, and since if we are talking about non-cash, we'll have to put that on the grant schedule, the fair market value at time of receipt. So you might want to include that in your notes section. Sometimes you'll receive cash and non-cash under the same award. You can indicate that if it's reimbursement or other. Just make sure you just kind of explain it, but this is a one-shop place that you can have all that information. Something that's even rarer are loans from federal programs. Economic development is one of these loans made from the feds that we see occasionally. The state revolving fund offered through the Indiana Finance Authority. Again, it should be very evident in the agreement, and you should indicate it in your note. There can also be program income, which again is somewhat rare. This generally happens when there's an advance, and the advance is great enough to generate interest income, which, you know, that's kind of not happening anymore. But anyway, that is required by the grant to be recognized as income, because some of them don't require that, but some of them do. With some programs, there are fees generated, and those fees are to be recognized as program income if that's a requirement of that grant. A change made by the feds is that program income will not be recognized on the grant schedule at all. And when you do your grant schedule in the gateway, you will find that there's not a column for program income. Last year we had you net the fee activity against the expenditures before you inputted that into the grant schedule. You can wipe that out of your mind. The feds, it's their prerogative. They've changed their mind on that, so just wipe that out. Just know if it's program income, it's not reflected in any way in the grant schedule. Next, we have fund number and name. This is what you're using in your accounting system. Remember, if it's federal, then the fund name should start with a CFDA number. Next, we have initiating office, contact name, phone number, and email. So whichever department is applied for that grant, then you should have a contact person. So if you've got questions, you've got that person you can talk to. Pass-through agency. Most county grants are from the state, so this would be the name of the state agency, which again should be in your grant agreement. It would be good for you to have the contact name and contact information, not just the department who applied for the grant, but it would be good for you too. There might be times like getting information for the grant schedule, but you might have questions about the type of expenditures that are being spent, you know, anything. So it's always good just to have this information. Is this a federal grant? Very, very important. Many of the grants that the counties receive are federal, but many are not. It should be identified as such in the grant agreement. Obviously, if it's a direct grant from the feds, you'll know what it is. But if it's from another entity, such as a state, it should be clearly identified what the funding source is, whether it's state or whether it's federal, or if it's a combination of the two, which that can occur also. If the grant agreement does not specify, don't assume. Just because the name sounds familiar, do not assume. You can't possibly know what source of funding that they're using. They change their sources because they've got, at the state level, they've got matching requirements that they have to meet also. So they might be sending certain kinds of funding streams down to you that are different than the prior year. So make sure that you get the information from them. Try to get it in an email, get some kind of documentation if it is not clear in the agreement. And it wouldn't hurt to remind them that it's their responsibility to provide you with this information. That is a federal requirement that they have under Circular A-133. And they're also supposed to tell you the federal agency name, the federal program name, and the CFDA number. Again, if they're not clearly addressed in the grant agreement, ask. And as I told you before, be very careful about making assumptions on similar names and saying, well, it was a juvenile grant here, so this has got to be the same thing. Might not be. So I just want you to be aware of that. We've had exceptions because of that. Again, I can't stress enough, get the information for them. I will say that in the past, we've provided you with a list of the most common federal grants and the website for federal grants identification. And this was a tool. This was not supposed to be the first stop for you to go to. I will go ahead and give you the website because I think it's also a very good place for you to go to make sure that the CFDA title that they put in there is the title that you're using in case that it's abbreviated or something in your grant agreement. The website for the CFDA numbers is www.cfda.gov. There are rare instances where a CFDA number has not been assigned to a grant by feds. Again, don't assume this is the case. Contact your grantor and get something in writing if they say it has no CFDA number. And then this way, at least you should also document who you called in the notes section of your summary, and if you've had to maybe rely on going to the website because that the information was not complete, you just couldn't get a straight answer from your grantor agency, then document that. At least then we'll know that you've got a policy and a process in place where you are trying to verify this information. Next is money passed through by the county to subrecipients. If this is something that the county plans on doing, then any money passed on will need to be identified and put onto the grant schedule and included as a note to the CFA schedules. Just as the state needs to let you know certain information, the county also needs to let their pass-throughs know actually the same information: CFDA, federal agency, and grant name. However, don't get confused with subrecipient versus vendor. Not all money passed through to another entity is really passed through, especially if it's an individual, especially individuals. An individual like who's receiving a shot is not a subrecipient, and so the value of the shot passed through to them or given to them, it would not be pass-through monies. It's a little more difficult when it comes to actual money going through. Again, on the circular A133, they provide both the definition of subrecipient and vendor, as well as the characteristics of the two. And I would really recommend that you make a copy of the A133 circular for your files, so if it does become a question, that you have an easy reference for that. This can be found at www.whitehouse.gov/OMB/circulars. Sure. www.whitehouse.gov/OMB/circulars. And you're looking for the A133. So for your grant schedule, you need to get this information, and of course, gathering this information should be part of your internal controls. Along with this summary, as we've stated before, you should have grant award letters, portions at least of the grant agreement that'll give you the information that you need, have that evidence there. There'll be other things that you'll need, like remittance advices from the state, which we'll talk about here in just a little bit. There may be other information that you find helpful depending on the grants that are applied for. So it's not something that I can give you a complete list of, but I think that if you at least get that grant award letter, grant agreement, that type of thing, the remittance advices, say like what Cynthia was talking about with this transfer, then that agreement would be something that you'd want in that file too, because that'll be an indication that there's something different going on with Title 4D that you need to be aware of. Another thing that I would do too is I would look at your prior year financial report, your CFA report, and see what grants were listed there. I think that's always very important to look at that, because maybe there were some adjustments made, grants added. You thought something was a state grant, but it turned out to be a federal grant, but you just, didn't make those changes in your file or whatever. That way, that could give you a clue of things that you need to be looking for. And this should just be part of your internal control. This would be just a step of your internal control that you would make that would show what you are doing in order to assure accuracy for your grant schedule. One thing that I have here is Either way, you'll want to be determining whether or not it should be included in your grant year. But gathering information is just really part of what you want to do. You also want to make sure that it's materially accurate schedule so that you don't have the finding. Actual inputting of the information is also very critical, and one of those critical elements is to properly identify whether or not a grant is an advance versus a reimbursement. Again, as I said before, an advance grant equal grant money received before the county makes disbursements, whereas for reimbursement grant, the county will expend its own funds first and then request reimbursement. Now, when you're entering into the grant schedule, you'll be entering both the receipts for the calendar year and the disbursements for the calendar year. What type of grant you have identified will determine what amount the receipt numbers or the disbursement numbers will be pulled into the macro and shown as the grant expenditures on the CFA report. Because if it's an advance grant, the expenditures on the CFA will equal disbursements. If it's a reimbursement grant, expenditures on the CFA will equal receipts. In other words, for an advance, you will show the expenditures as they occurred. What is reflected in your fund activity as an expenditure will also be reflected on the grant schedule. For a reimbursement grant, the amount shown as the expenditure on the grant schedule will actually be the amount reimbursed. This is really a more conservative approach, as what you expend and request for reimbursement may not always fully be reimbursed. And again, that's why it's very, very important that you make sure that you document, that you have the documentation of what it is, if it's an advance versus reimbursement, and then that you document it and that you input it properly into the gateway system. Just as critical will it be to make sure that you report on Gateway the correct amounts under the disbursement and receipt columns. You're on cash basis, and so will report the actual receipts and disbursements during your calendar year. Also, if there are matching funds, as I said before, those are not included. So if you have a fund that's set up separately to account for the financial activity, which is what you generally should do, and let's say that 2012 there were disbursements of $10,000 and there's no matching, then $10,000 is what you would input. If there was a local match of 30%, which you would have included in your fund, then you would take, for total disbursements, $10,000, then you would input $7,000 as the federal disbursement. Also remember that what you input is what is going to be coming out. And when I say input, I'm talking about with the gateway system. So, spelling, using the proper names of the grants, pass-through, federal agencies, this is all very important as well. Again, I would maybe even go to the prior year's CFA, because there are a lot of times you're going to be having the same grants over and over again. Again, having an internal control policy and process in place to check for accuracy and completeness of your grant schedule is a key component of what the feds expect you to have in place. It's not just us, it's the feds are expecting this. And one recommendation that the field examiners did have was that you have somebody else check your work. I don't know how many times I think I've done something, maybe not perfectly, but pretty close, and then Tammy will check it and she'll go, no. And I will do the same for her. We all make mistakes, and they can be, well, as Dan showed on missing his slide, it can be something that you just think, oh, I've checked through this. It happens. That's why it's good to have, as part of your policy and your process, somebody else double checking your work. That would be a very good control to have in place. I'm going to get through the rest of this quickly here. So Last year in the fall, I had gone over the Title 4D and how to report in detail, as this is one of the grants that you all have. And so I'm just going to go over it briefly here so that it'll just kind of give you a refresher on that, as well as maybe some ideas for other grants. For starters, there's the basic reimbursement for direct and indirect 4D costs. The county upfronts these costs. It fills out and submits the form detailing these costs to DCS, and then the state EFTs the money to you. Right away, there are two big things to think about. One, and this is the only exception I know for the rule that each grant should be maintained in its own separate fund, or should be, the disbursement and receipt activity are not occurring in a separate fund. Title 4D has several separate funds, but these are incentive, and this is not for the activity of direct and indirect costs. The disbursement and receipt activity for the direct and indirect costs are mainly happening through the general fund, so you are tracking the direct and indirect cost disbursements probably as a line item for each prosecutor, clerk. It might vary from county to county, but whatever you're doing to identify these costs as direct and indirect. Those disbursements that occurred during the calendar year will be what you put onto the annual report grant schedule. And now this for the grant, for the receipt side, and this is very important. When you get money from the state, you will also receive remittance advices from the Auditor of State. And here's an example of this. And this is important because while it's important that you maintain these remittance, and again, you might consider keeping it in a separate file, 4D file, the remittance advices that you receive from DCS are very, very critical. The Auditor of State remittances do not have detail, as you can see here, that the DCS remittances will have. And this could be true for other grants as well. As you can see here, the Auditor of State remittance provides total, states that it's for prosecutors, clerks, and courts, but it does not break down the amounts between them. And that detail is critical in determining what is federal versus state funding for a portion of these reimbursements. And remember, since this is a reimbursement grant, it is the receipt amounts that will be carried over as your total federal expenditures. So I'll break this down and go over a DCS. Reimbursement for indirect is 100% federal. As you can see, it's really straightforward. DCS will, if it's indirect costs, they always separate that out from direct costs on their remittance advices. They will say indirect costs. And it will provide you with a CFDA number, has county name, what quarter the reimbursement is for, which is not really germane for your grant schedule, but it does give you sufficient information so that you should be able to use it for your grant schedule. On the direct cost remittance, you can expect to see reimbursement to the clerks, courts, and prosecutors, though all three may not be included every time. The amounts indicated on the remittance for the reimbursements of direct costs to clerks and courts are always 100% federal. This is not